Chapter 1. The Island of Ithaca. Far away on the western edge of the Greek world, where the sea is bluer than anywhere else and the sun sets behind a long line of small islands, there is an island called Ithaca. Ithaca is not a large island. It is rocky, and there are goats on the hillsides, and olive trees with their silver-green leaves, and small white houses with red roofs, and the wind blows through them all the time, smelling of salt and herbs. The people who live there know every cove and every cliff. They know which paths the goats take and which figs are sweetest. They know which winds bring rain. A long time ago, on this small island, there lived a king named Odysseus. Odysseus was not the biggest of kings or the richest. His kingdom was just the one little island and a few smaller ones nearby. But Odysseus was, perhaps, the cleverest person who had ever lived. He could think his way out of any trouble. He could solve any puzzle. He could tell a story so beautifully that the listeners forgot to eat their dinners. Odysseus was married to a queen named Penelope, who was as clever and patient as he was. They had a baby son named Telemachus, with dark curly hair and bright eyes, and the three of them lived together in a palace on the hill above the harbour, and they were as happy as people can be. But you remember the city of Troy, on the other side of the sea. You remember the 1,000 ships and the war that lasted 10 years. Odysseus was one of the Greek kings who sailed away to fight in that war. He did not want to go. He had a wife and a small baby and a quiet kingdom, and he loved them all. But when Agamemnon called the kings together, Odysseus had to go. He kissed Penelope goodbye. He kissed the baby goodbye. He climbed into his ship, 12 ships actually, full of his Ithacan men, and he sailed away across the bright water. He said he would be home in a year, maybe 2. He was wrong. The war lasted 10 years, and then, when the war was finally over and Troy had fallen, Odysseus turned his 12 ships toward home, and the journey home took 10 years more. 20 years. 20 years since he had kissed Penelope goodbye. 20 years since he had held the baby, who would no longer be a baby. This is the story of the journey home. It is a long story, full of strange islands and strange creatures and strange weather. But you do not need to remember all of it. You only need to remember that, no matter where Odysseus wandered, his heart was always pointing toward Ithaca, the way a compass needle points north, even when he was lost, even when he was tired, even when the wind blew him to the wrong side of the world. His heart pointed home. Chapter 2. The Cyclops in the Cave. The journey began badly. Odysseus and his 12 ships left the smoking ruins of Troy and turned south. They were tired. They were seasick of the war. They wanted to get home, eat their wives' good cooking, and sleep in their own beds. The first storm blew them off course almost at once. They drifted for 9 days, and on the 10th day they came to a strange shore where the people ate a kind of flower called the lotus. The flower made you forget everything, your home, your family, your name. Some of Odysseus's men ate it and forgot they wanted to go home at all. They sat down on the beach and smiled foolishly at the sky. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships, weeping and laughing, and tie them down until the lotus wore off. The next island looked friendlier. It was green, with a meadow rolling down to the sea and a herd of fat goats. The men were hungry. They landed and caught some goats and roasted them on the beach. But the men did not know that the island belonged to a race of giants called the Cyclopes. giants with only one great round eye in the middle of their foreheads. Odysseus, being curious, which was both his great gift and his great trouble, wanted to see the giants. He took 12 of his men and a goatskin full of strong dark wine, and they walked up the hillside to a great cave with sheep grazing outside. The cave was huge. The fire pit was the size of a small house. The cheeses on the shelves were the size of wagon wheels. The men should have run away at once. Instead, they sat down by the fire to wait for whoever lived there. Whoever lived there came home at sunset, driving his sheep before him into the cave. He was a giant. His one eye was as big as a dinner plate. His name was Polyphemus. When he saw the men, he was not friendly. He rolled an enormous stone across the cave mouth, a stone so big that 20 men could not have moved it, and trapped them all inside. And then he ate 2 of the men for his dinner. I am sorry. I know that is a frightening thing. But do not worry. Odysseus is going to get the others out, and the giant will be the one who loses in the end. Listen. That night, while the giant slept, Odysseus thought. He thought all night. By morning he had a plan. When the giant woke up, Odysseus offered him the goatskin full of strong dark wine. The giant had never tasted wine before. He drank it all. He liked it very much. "What is your name, little man?" the giant asked. And Odysseus, being clever, remember, said, "My name is Nobody." "Nobody," said the giant, slurring his words because of the wine. "I will give you a gift for this fine drink, Nobody. I will eat you last." And he laughed a great booming laugh that shook the cave, and then he fell asleep, snoring like an earthquake. While the giant snored, Odysseus and his men took a great wooden pole, sharpened the end to a point, heated it in the fire until it glowed, and, well, they put out the giant's eye. I will not describe it. It is enough to say that the giant could no longer see them. The giant howled. He shouted for help. The other Cyclopes on the island heard him and came running. "Polyphemus, what is wrong? Who has hurt you?" "Nobody," howled the giant. "Nobody is hurting me." "Well," said the other Cyclopes, "if nobody is hurting you, then there is no problem." And they went home, grumbling, back to their own caves. You see, clever Odysseus. In the morning, the blinded giant rolled the great stone away to let his sheep out to pasture. He sat in the doorway, feeling each sheep with his huge hands as it went past, to make sure no men were trying to escape. But Odysseus had tied his men under the sheep, clinging to their bellies, hidden in the thick wool. The giant felt only sheep going by. And so the men escaped, one by one, out into the morning light. They ran for the ships. They pushed off from the shore. They rowed as fast as they could. And here, Odysseus made his one great mistake. He could not resist. He stood at the back of the ship, and he shouted across the water, "Cyclops, if anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, king of Ithaca." The giant heard him, and the giant, in his rage and his pain, prayed to his father, for his father was none other than Poseidon, the great god of the sea. "Father," the giant cried, "punish this man Odysseus. Do not let him come home easily. Let him wander for years and years on your wide sea." And Poseidon, in his palace under the waves, heard his son. And Poseidon was angry, and that, more than anything else, is why the journey home took so long. Chapter 3. The Bag of Winds and the Witch's Island. The ship sailed on, away from the island of the Cyclops. The men were sad about the friends they had lost. Odysseus was quiet for a long time. He had learned something he would not forget. Cleverness is good, but pride is dangerous. After many days, they came to a floating island made of bronze, where a kind king named Aeolus lived. Aeolus was the keeper of the winds. He held all the winds of the world in his palace, and he could let them out or call them back whenever he wished. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus. He fed the men, he listened to their stories, and when they left, he gave Odysseus a wonderful gift, a great leather bag tied tight with a silver cord. Inside this bag, Aeolus said, are all the winds of the world, except one. I have kept out only the gentle west wind, which will blow you straight home to Ithaca. Do not open the bag. Whatever you do, do not let the other winds out. Odysseus thanked him. He sailed away with the bag tied to the mast. The west wind blew softly, steadily, day after day, exactly toward Ithaca. For 9 days, Odysseus stood at the steering oar, never sleeping, watching the wind, watching the bag, watching the sea. On the 10th day, the men could see Ithaca on the horizon, the green hills, the white houses, the smoke rising from the cooking fires. And then Odysseus, exhausted from 9 days without sleep, sat down on the deck and closed his eyes for just a moment. His men, sailing all this way, had been wondering about the bag. They thought, surely, it must be full of gold and treasure that Odysseus was keeping for himself. They whispered to each other, they argued, and finally, while Odysseus slept, one of them crept up to the bag and untied the silver cord, just to see. All the winds of the world rushed out at once. There was a roar like the end of the world. The ships were caught in a tornado of winds, north wind, south wind, east wind, all fighting each other. The men were knocked off their feet. Ithaca disappeared. The ships were blown all the way back across the sea to where they had started. When Odysseus woke up, he could have wept. He went back to Aeolus and begged for help. But Aeolus shook his head sadly. The gods are against you, he said. I cannot help you again. And he sent them away. So they rowed on with no wind for many days. The sea was empty, the men were tired, and at last they came to another island, green and quiet, with a fine stone house among the trees, and smoke rising from its chimney. This was the island of Circe. Circe was a witch, or a sorceress, which is a fancier word for the same thing. She lived alone in her house with many strange animals around her. The animals had been visitors once. She had turned them into lions and wolves and pigs, and now they followed her about, gentle as kittens, but never able to be men again. Half of Odysseus's men went up to the house. Circe welcomed them. She gave them honey cakes and barley and cheese and wine. They ate everything. They felt sleepy and full and happy. And then Circe touched them with her wand, one by one, and turned them into pigs. She drove them into a pen behind the house, and there they squealed and snuffled and rooted in the mud, and they could not even remember being men. One man had not eaten the food. He ran back to the ship and told Odysseus everything. Odysseus drew his sword and marched up to the house alone. On the way, the messenger god Hermes appeared to him, a young man with winged sandals, and gave him a magical white flower called moly, which would protect him from Circe's magic. When Odysseus came into the house, Circe gave him the same food. He ate it. She touched him with her wand. Nothing happened. He drew his sword and held it to her throat. Circe was astonished. She fell to her knees. "You must be Odysseus," she said. "Hermes told me long ago that one day a clever man named Odysseus would come and resist my magic. Please, put down your sword.
Stay with me, be my guest. I will turn your men back. And she did. She touched each pig with her wand, and they became men again, only younger and stronger than before, as if she were apologizing. Odysseus and his men stayed with Circe for a whole year. They ate well. They rested. They almost forgot for a while that they were trying to get home, but only almost. When the year was up, the men came to Odysseus and said, "Captain, it is time. Ithaca is waiting." And Odysseus knew they were right. He went to Circe and told her they must leave. Circe was sad, but she was not unkind. "If you must go home," she said, "you will need to do one last difficult thing first. You must sail to the very edge of the world and speak to the ghost of a wise old prophet who will tell you the way." And so, in the morning, they sailed away from her island toward the edge of the world.
Chapter 4. The Edge of the World. This is a quieter chapter, the kind where your eyes may begin to feel heavy. The ship sailed for many days under a soft, gentle wind that Circe had sent. The men did not have to row. They only had to sit and watch the water and think their thoughts. The water changed as they sailed. It became darker and stiller, like a deep pond. The sun grew dim. There were no birds. The men did not speak above a whisper. At last they came to a misty shore where the great river Ocean, the river that the ancient people believed flowed all the way around the world, flowed slowly past tall, dark trees. There was no real day here, and no real night, only a soft grey twilight that never changed. This was the edge of the world. Beyond it lay the land of the dead, where the ghosts of all the people who had ever lived drifted quietly among the shadows. It was not a frightening place. It was only a sad place, and a quiet one. Odysseus stepped ashore alone. Circe had told him exactly what to do. He dug a small pit in the soft earth. He poured into it milk and honey and wine and water and white barley, the way you might leave a gift for someone. And then he sat by the pit and waited. The ghosts came. They came drifting out of the mist, silent as leaves falling. There were so many of them. Old men, old women, young soldiers, children, people Odysseus had known, and people he had not. They looked at him with quiet, curious eyes, and they did not speak, because the dead cannot speak unless they are given something to drink first. Among them, Odysseus saw a face he knew. It was his own mother. She had been alive when he had sailed away to Troy. He had not known she had died. He had not been there. He had not said goodbye. Odysseus wanted to run to her, but he made himself wait because he had to speak to the prophet first. The old prophet drifted up, a man named Tiresias with long white hair and eyes that had been blind in life but saw clearly now. Odysseus let him drink, and the prophet spoke. "Odysseus," the prophet said softly, "you will come home to Ithaca, but your way will be hard. You will lose all your ships. You will lose all your men. You will come home alone, and you will come home as a beggar, but you will come home. Trust the gods. Be patient. And when you have done what you must do at home, you will live to be old, and you will die peacefully by the sea, with your wife beside you." Odysseus thanked the old prophet. The prophet drifted back into the mist. Then Odysseus let his mother drink, and she looked at him with her eyes full of love, and they talked for a long time. She told him that Penelope was well. She told him that little Telemachus had grown tall and good. She told him that the old men of Ithaca still waited for him, and that the dogs still listened for his step on the path. "I died of missing you," she said gently. "But do not grieve. Come home, my son. And when you do, tell Penelope that I loved her like a daughter." Odysseus reached out to embrace her, but his arms passed through her like mist. She was a ghost. He could not hold her. They could only look at each other. After a while, his mother drifted back into the grey country, and Odysseus stood alone by the pit, and he wept. But he wept gently, the way you weep when something sad has happened, but you understand it now. He went back to the ship. He told his men what the prophet had said, and they turned the ship around, and they began the long sail home. Chapter 5. The Sirens and the Two Sea Monsters. The route home was full of dangers. Circe had warned them about everyone. First, they had to pass the island of the Sirens. The Sirens were two creatures who sat on rocks in the middle of the sea and sang. Their song was the most beautiful sound in the world. Any sailor who heard it would steer his ship toward the rocks, and the ship would break apart, and the sailor would drown. Circe had told Odysseus what to do. He took a great lump of beeswax from the stores and warmed it in his hands until it was soft. He gave a piece to each of his men, and they stuffed the wax into their ears so they could hear nothing at all. Then they tied Odysseus to the mast of the ship very tightly with many ropes. "Whatever I shout," Odysseus told them, "do not untie me. Do not slow down. Just row and look straight ahead until we are far past." The men nodded. They could not hear, but they could see him nod, and they understood. They rowed past the island. Odysseus heard the song. Oh, the song! It was more beautiful than he had imagined. The sirens sang of glory and of home and of secrets only the dead knew. They sang of his wife and his son. They sang of his mother. They sang in the voices of every person he had ever loved. Odysseus thrashed against the ropes. He screamed at his men to untie him. He begged. He wept. But the men could not hear him, and they rowed on, faces set, eyes forward. After a long time, the island fell behind them, and the song faded. The men took the wax out of their ears. They untied Odysseus. He sat on the deck, shaking for a long time. But he had passed the sirens. He had heard their song and lived. Next came the worst part of the journey. There were two sea monsters who lived on either side of a narrow strait. The ship had to pass between them. There was no other way. On one side was Charybdis, a great whirlpool that sucked down the sea 3 times a day and spat it back up. Any ship that came too close would be pulled down to the bottom and lost. On the other side was Scylla, a horrible creature with 6 long necks and 6 terrible heads, who lived in a high cave on a cliff and snatched sailors from passing ships. 6 sailors, every time. Always 6. There was no way to avoid both. If you steered away from the whirlpool, you came under the cliff. If you steered away from the cliff, you went into the whirlpool. Circe had told Odysseus, "Steer toward Scylla. Better to lose 6 men than to lose the whole ship." It was the hardest order Odysseus had ever given. He did not even tell his men what was coming, because he did not want them to be afraid. He just told them to row hard, to row fast, to pass through this strait quickly. They came into the strait. The whirlpool roared on one side, terrifying, sucking down the sea. The men stared at it in horror. They did not look up at the cliff on the other side. And from the cliff, Scylla's 6 long necks shot down, and she snatched 6 men from the deck and lifted them up to her cave, and they were gone. The other men kept rowing, weeping, but they kept rowing. The ship shot through the strait and out the other side, into open water. Odysseus stood at the back of the ship and looked back at the cliff. It was the saddest thing he had ever done. He carried it with him for the rest of his life. The ship sailed on. Chapter 6. The Island of the Sun. After the strait, the men were exhausted. They needed rest. They needed somewhere quiet to land. Ahead of them was an island. It was green and gentle, with a meadow and many trees and a herd of beautiful white cattle grazing in the long grass. It looked like the most peaceful place in the world. But Circe had warned Odysseus, and the prophet at the edge of the world had warned him too. This was the Island of the Sun. The cattle did not belong to a farmer. They belonged to Helios, the great sun god, who saw everything from his bright chariot up in the sky. The cattle were his pride and joy. They never grew old. They never died. He counted them every day, and if anyone harmed even one of them, his anger would be terrible. "We must not land," Odysseus told his men. "The prophet warned me. We must sail past." But his men were too tired. They begged. They needed sleep. They promised they would only rest, not touch the cattle. Odysseus, against his better judgment, gave in. He made each man swear a solemn promise. They would eat only the food they had brought with them. They would not touch the cattle. Not one. They landed. They camped on the beach. They slept. And then the wind changed. A great storm blew up, and it blew for a month. The ship could not leave. The food ran out. The men were starving. They held on as long as they could. They tried to fish, but the fish would not bite. They tried to catch birds, but the birds flew away. They grew weaker and weaker. One day, when Odysseus had gone up the hillside alone to pray to the gods for help, his men gave in. They were too hungry to resist any longer. They killed one of the white cattle, and they roasted it, and they ate. When Odysseus came back down and saw what they had done, he put his hands over his face. He knew immediately what was going to happen. Up in the sky, Helios saw too. He shouted to great Zeus on Mount Olympus, "These men have eaten my cattle. Punish them, or I will go down to the underworld and shine for the dead instead of for the living." And Zeus, on his cloud, nodded. When the storm finally ended and the ship sailed away from the island, Zeus sent a thunderbolt down from the sky. It struck the ship in the middle. The mast snapped. The deck broke apart. The ship sank. Every man on board drowned. Every man except Odysseus. He clung to a broken piece of the mast. He floated alone on the empty sea. The waves carried him for 9 days and 9 nights, until he was so tired he could barely hold on. On the 10th day, the waves washed him up on the shore of another island. He crawled up the beach. He fell asleep in the warm sand. He had lost all his ships. He had lost all his men. He was alone. He had come, without knowing it, to the island of Calypso. Chapter 7. The Island of Calypso. Calypso was a kind of goddess, a nymph, the people of those days called her, which means a spirit of a wild place. She lived alone on her island, in a soft cave hung with green vines, where the air always smelled of cedar and wildflowers. She had violets growing at her door. She had a fire that never went out. She sang as she wove on her loom. When Calypso found Odysseus washed up on her beach, she carried him to her cave and made him warm. She fed him. She tended his hurts. She listened to his stories. And as the days passed, she fell in love with him, and she could not bear to let him go. "Stay with me," she said. "I will make you immortal. You will never grow old. You will never die. You will live with me on this island forever, and we will be happy." It was a very great offer. Many people would have said yes. Odysseus said no. He thanked her gently every time. He told her that her island was beautiful, and that she was kind, and that he was grateful for everything. But every evening after dinner, he would walk down to the beach and sit on a rock and look out across the sea in the direction he thought Ithaca might be. And he would think of Penelope, who would be older now, with maybe grey in her dark hair, and of Telemachus, who would be a young man now, almost 20 years old, whom he would not recognize. And he would weep quietly, the way people weep when there is no one to comfort them. He stayed on Calypso's island for 7 years. 7 years. Imagine that. 7 years of beautiful food and soft beds and a kind companion. And every evening he went down to the beach and looked toward home. Up on Mount Olympus, the grey-eyed goddess Athena, who had always loved Odysseus because he was clever and she was the goddess of cleverness, finally went to her father Zeus. "Father," she said, "it has been long enough. Odysseus has suffered enough. It is time to let him go home." Zeus, who had been busy with other matters, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it is time." He sent the messenger god Hermes flying down to Calypso's island. Hermes landed lightly outside her cave and gave her the news. "Zeus says you must let him go." Calypso wept. She had loved Odysseus very much, but she was a goddess and she could not disobey Zeus. So she went to Odysseus on the beach and she sat beside him and she told him, "You may go home," she said. "I will help you. Tomorrow we will build you a raft and you will sail away." Odysseus could not believe it. He had stopped hoping after so many years. He took her hand. He thanked her. There were tears in his eyes, but they were the good kind of tears. The next morning, they cut down 20 tall trees. Calypso helped him. She gave him good tools, an axe and a great auger for drilling holes. And they worked together for 4 days, building a raft with a mast and a sail and a steering oar. On the 5th day, the raft was ready. Calypso filled it with bread and water and wine and warm cloaks. She gave Odysseus a sweet, gentle wind to send him on his way. He sailed away from her island. He did not look back. He looked forward, toward home. He sailed for 17 days under bright stars and gentle breezes, and on the 18th day he saw land on the horizon. It was not Ithaca yet, but it was close. Chapter 8. The Kindness of Strangers. The land Odysseus saw was the island of the Phaeacians, a peaceful people who lived in a beautiful city by the sea, ruled by a kind king named Alcinous and his wise queen Arete. But before Odysseus could reach the island, the angry sea god Poseidon, who had been waiting all these years to punish Odysseus for blinding his son the Cyclops, saw him from far away and sent a terrible storm. For 2 days the storm tossed Odysseus on the waves. The raft broke apart. Odysseus clung to a single plank. The waves were as tall as houses. He thought again and again that he would drown, but a kind sea nymph saw him struggling and took pity on him. She rose up out of the waves, a pale young woman with seaweed in her hair, and gave him a magic veil. "Wrap this around your chest," she said, "and the sea cannot hurt you. Swim to the island, then throw the veil back into the water and do not look back." Odysseus did as she said. He swam for 2 days and 2 nights. The veil kept him afloat. He swam until his arms could not move any more, and then he kept swimming. And at last he washed up on a beach, more dead than alive. He threw the veil back into the sea, and he crawled up under some bushes by a river, and he fell asleep in the leaves like a small animal. In the morning he was woken up by laughter. He peeked out from the bushes. On the river bank, a group of young women were doing the washing. They had brought down baskets of clothes and were washing them in the river and spreading them out to dry on the warm stones. They were playing a game with a ball, throwing it back and forth and laughing. In the middle of them was a princess, tall and lovely, with dark braided hair. Her name was Nausicaa, and she was the daughter of King Alcinous. She had come down to the river that morning because the goddess Athena had whispered to her in a dream that today she would meet someone interesting. Odysseus, who was naked and dirty and covered in salt, did not want to frighten the young women. He broke off a leafy branch to cover himself and stepped out from the bushes very slowly. The other girls screamed and ran, but Nausicaa stood still. She looked at this strange, weather-beaten man, and she was not afraid. Her parents had taught her that any stranger might be a god in disguise, and so all strangers must be treated kindly. "Sir," she said calmly, "you look as though you have suffered. Come, eat with us. We will give you clothes and food, and we will take you back to my father's city." Odysseus could have wept at her kindness. He bowed to her. "Princess," he said, "may the gods give you everything your heart desires. A good husband, a happy home, children who love you. You have saved my life." The young women gave him clean clothes and food and oil to rub on his skin. They led him back to the city. The king and queen welcomed him into their palace. They sat him by a great fire. They gave him a feast. That night, after dinner, the king's poet sang a song, and the song happened to be about the war at Troy and the wooden horse and the cleverness of Odysseus. Odysseus, listening, hid his face in his cloak. The tears came. He could not help them. The king saw and gently asked, "My friend, why do you weep at this song? Did you lose someone at Troy?" And Odysseus, after a long pause, said quietly, "King Alcinous, I am Odysseus." The whole hall fell silent. The poet stopped playing. The servants stopped serving. The queen's hand froze in mid-air. Odysseus, the famous Odysseus, the cleverest of the Greeks, was sitting at their fire. The king stood up. He took Odysseus's hand. "Friend," he said, "tell us your story, all of it. We have all night." And Odysseus told them everything: the Cyclops, the witch, the edge of the world, the sirens, the sea monsters, the cattle of the sun, the 7 years on Calypso's island. The hall listened, hardly breathing. The fire burned low and was built up again. The stars wheeled across the sky outside the windows. When at last he finished, just before dawn, the king said, "Tomorrow we will send you home." And in the morning they did. They gave him gifts, bronze and gold and fine cloth, and they put him on one of their magical ships, which could sail faster than any other ship in the world. The crew tucked him in under a soft cloak on the deck, and Odysseus, exhausted, fell asleep. He slept the deepest sleep of his life. He did not feel the ship leave the harbor. He did not feel the long sail. He did not feel anything until the ship grounded gently on a beach, and the crew lifted him, still sleeping, and laid him on the sand with all his gifts arranged neatly beside him, and the ship sailed silently away. When Odysseus woke up, he was lying on a beach. He did not, at first, recognize where he was. There was a mist over everything. But then the mist cleared, and he saw the shape of the hills, and the curve of the harbor, and the path that wound up B. Chapter 9. The Stranger at the Gate. But Odysseus could not simply walk up the path to his palace and say, "I am home." 20 years had passed. He did not know what had happened in those years. He did not know who could be trusted. And the grey-eyed goddess Athena came to him on the beach, disguised this time as a young shepherd, and she told him everything. The news was hard. Penelope was still alive. She was still waiting. But for the last few years, more than 100 young men from the noble families of Ithaca had been camped in the palace, eating Odysseus's food and drinking his wine, demanding that Penelope marry one of them. They believed Odysseus must be dead. They called themselves suitors, which is an old word for someone who wants to marry you. Penelope had refused. For years she had put them off with one trick after another. Once she said she could not marry until she finished weaving a great burial cloth for her father-in-law. She wove all day in front of everyone, and every night, secretly, she unraveled what she had woven, so the cloth would never be finished. The suitors did not notice for 3 years, but now they had figured it out. They were angry. They were getting bolder. Penelope was running out of tricks. And Telemachus, little Telemachus, who had been a baby when Odysseus sailed away, was now a young man. He was good and brave, but he was just 1 against 100. Odysseus listened to all of this with his face very still. "What should I do?" he asked the goddess. "Be patient," said Athena, "and be clever. Do not let them know you are home, not yet. I will disguise you as an old beggar. Go up to the palace as a beggar. See for yourself. Bide your time. When the moment comes, you will know it." She touched him with her wand, and his skin became wrinkled, and his back became bent, and his clothes became rags. He looked like an old, old man. He walked up the path. The first person he met was an old swineherd named Eumaeus, a man who had served the family loyally for 40 years and never stopped believing his master would come home. Eumaeus did not recognize Odysseus, but he was kind to the old beggar. He brought him in. He gave him food and wine and a place by the fire. He spoke lovingly about his lost master. Odysseus had to bite his tongue to keep from saying who he was. The next morning, Telemachus came to the swineherd's hut. He was tall now, a young man, looking very much like his father had looked at 20. He greeted the old beggar politely. He did not recognize him. When the swineherd had stepped outside, Athena flickered through the room, and for just a moment, she changed Odysseus back to his real self. Telemachus stared. "Who are you?" he whispered. Are you a god?" "No," said Odysseus quietly. "I am your father." And Telemachus, who could barely remember his father, who had grown up hearing stories about him and had imagined him every night, Telemachus ran into his arms and wept, and Odysseus held him and wept too. And they sat together for a long time, father and son, the long missing years all flowing back together at once. When they could speak again, they made a plan. The next day, Odysseus went up to the palace, still disguised as the old beggar. The suitors were there, lounging at his tables, eating his food, throwing scraps to the dogs. They laughed at the old beggar. One of them threw a stool at him. Odysseus did not say anything. He just sat in the corner and watched. He saw Penelope from across the room. She was older. There were silver threads in her dark hair. There were lines at the corners of her eyes. But she was still Penelope, clever, patient, beautiful, in the quiet way that has nothing to do with being young. She did not recognize the old beggar. How could she? But she was kind to him, the way she was kind to everyone. She gave him bread. She asked him gently if he had any news of her husband who had been lost at sea for 20 years. Odysseus, looking at her, almost broke, but he held himself together. "Lady," he said carefully, "I knew your husband. He was a great man, and I have heard he is coming home soon, very soon, within the year." Penelope smiled sadly. She had heard such promises before. She thanked the old beggar and went up to her room. That night, she announced to the suitors that she had finally decided. She would marry whichever of them could string her husband's great bow, the bow Odysseus had left behind, which only Odysseus could string, and shoot an arrow through the holes of 12 axe heads set up in a row. The suitors laughed and agreed. They thought this would be easy. It was not easy. One by one, every suitor tried. None of them could even bend the bow. The string would not stretch. They tried oil. They tried warming the wood. Nothing worked. Then the old beggar shuffled forward and asked if he might try. The suitors laughed at him, but Telemachus said, "Let him try. What is the harm?" And Odysseus took up the great bow that he had not held in 20 years. He felt its familiar weight. He looked it over, like a musician checking an old instrument. And then, with one easy motion, he bent the bow and strung it. The room went silent. He set an arrow on the string. He drew it back. He let it fly. The arrow shot straight through every one of the 12 axe heads, perfectly, without touching the edges. He turned to look at the suitors. They saw his eyes, and they understood, all at once, who he was. I will not tell you what happened next. It is enough to say that Odysseus and Telemachus and the swineherd and one other loyal servant fought the suitors that day, and Athena was with them, and by the evening the palace was their own again. It is a sad part of the story, and it is bedtime, and we will not dwell on it. But there is one more scene to tell, the most important scene of all, and it is the gentlest. Chapter 10. The Olive Tree Bed. When everything was finally quiet, Odysseus went up the stone stairs of the palace to the room at the top, where Penelope was sitting by a small lamp, waiting. She had heard the news from her maid. She knew the old beggar had been Odysseus all along. She knew her husband had come home. But she had been waiting for 20 years. She had been tricked many times in those 20 years by people pretending to bring news of him. She had learned painfully not to believe too easily. She looked at the man standing in her doorway. He looked like Odysseus. He looked exactly like Odysseus. But she had to be sure. She had to be absolutely sure. Her heart could not bear to be wrong. So she said calmly to the servant beside her, "Make up a bed for our guest in the hallway. Bring the bed out of our chamber and set it up for him there." Odysseus stared at her. "Wife," he said, "what are you saying? No one can move our bed." "I built our bed myself 25 years ago when we were young. I built it around an olive tree. The trunk of the tree is one of the bedposts. The other 3 posts I carved from the same wood. The whole bed is rooted to the floor of this palace. It cannot be moved unless someone has cut it free. Has someone cut it free? Has someone destroyed our bed?" And Penelope's face changed, because no one in the world knew that secret. No one but Odysseus. She had not told anyone, not even her maid. The bed and the olive tree had been their private thing, the secret of their marriage, the symbol of the home they had built together when they were 19 years old and the whole world was new. She crossed the room and she put her arms around him. And she wept, and he wept, and they stood there together for a long time, in the lamplight, holding each other, while outside the window the stars came out one by one over the island of Ithaca. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I had to be sure. I have been alone for so long." "I know," he whispered back. "I have been alone too. I am here. I am home." And later, they sat together on the edge of the olive tree bed that no one had moved, and they talked. He told her about everything that had happened: the Cyclops, the witch, the edge of the world, the 7 years on the island, the long swim, the kind princess on the beach. She told him about the suitors, and about her loom, and about how their son had grown. They talked all night. Athena, who loved them both, made the night last longer than usual so they could finish, and as the first light came up grey and pink over the eastern sea, Penelope rested her head on Odysseus's shoulder, and they sat in the quiet, and they were home. That is where the story ends. Not with a battle, not with glory, with a husband and wife sitting on the edge of an old bed, in a small house on a small island, watching the dawn come. The journey had taken 20 years. It had cost him everything: his ships, his men, his youth. But he had come home, and his wife had waited, and his son had grown up good. And in the end, when everything had been counted up, the most important thing, the thing the whole story had really been about, was not the monsters or the witches or the islands. It was that one person had been trying to come home, and another person had been waiting for him, and they had both kept faith for 20 years, and now they were together again. Outside your window somewhere, the same stars are shining that shone on Odysseus and Penelope that morning. The Great Bear, the Hunter, the Pleiades, those 7 small sisters, the same stars Odysseus steered by all those long years on the sea. The waves are hushing somewhere far away. Hush, hush, hush. The lamps in the palace have burned down low. The old swineherd is asleep in his hut on the hillside, smiling. The dogs of Ithaca are curled up by the doors. The journey is over. The traveller is home. And it is time now for you to close your eyes. Good night, little wanderer. Good night, brave heart. Good night.